Sometimes the greatest act of courage is staying silent when the world demands you speak. For 8 years, young Ingrid chose silence over slavery, pretending to be mute rather than become another man's property. In her Norse village, women were claimed like cattle, but she found safety in the shadows as the healer's quiet daughter. Everyone believed the gods had touched her tongue and stolen her voice. They were wrong. When Rurik the Bear returned from exile, everything changed. The giant Viking warrior saw through her act immediately. His pale eyes recognized what others missed, that her silence wasn't weakness, but survival. Now her secret was in the hands of the most dangerous man in the village. He could expose her with a single word, destroying 8 years of careful deception. But what happens when the most dangerous man in the village becomes her unlikely protector? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like a shroud, and Ingrid moved through it as she had for 8 years, silent as a ghost, invisible as shadow. Her worn leather boots made no sound on the dew-slicked stones as she descended toward the village of Ravenshollow, the ancient healing pouch at her hip swaying with each careful step. Inside that weathered pouch lay herbs that could mend bones and stop bleeding, but more importantly, it held the secret of who she truly was. The village stirred to life below her, smoke rising from longhouse chimneys, the distant sound of axes biting wood, the low murmur of voices planning another day of survival. This was the world she knew, harsh, unforgiving, where strength ruled and the weak served the strong. Where women were property to be claimed, traded, or taken by force. Ingrid's fingers traced the worn leather of her pouch, feeling the familiar weight of dried willow bark, yarrow, and elderflower. Her mother had taught her the old ways, before fever took her when Ingrid was barely 14. That same year, Eric Gunnarson had tried to claim her, cornering her in the grain storehouse with his father's blessing and his own cruel hunger. She could still remember his hands on her shoulders, his breath hot against her neck, his words like venom. "You'll learn to like it, girl." All women do. That night she had made her choice. Better to be seen as touched by the gods than touched by men like him. The ruse had been simple at first, a gradual withdrawal of her voice, speaking less and less, until the village believed grief had stolen her words. Old Astrid, the village's senior healer, had taken pity on what she saw as a broken child and taught her the deeper mysteries of herb lore. The other villagers learned to communicate with her through gestures and nods, and eventually they stopped expecting words at all. "The gods work in mysterious ways," Astrid would say when people questioned Ingrid's silence. Perhaps they saved her voice for something greater. If only she knew how right she was. Ingrid reached the village square as the sun crested the surrounding peaks, painting the wooden buildings in shades of gold and amber. The longhouse of Jarl Gunnar dominated the center, its dragon-carved posts speaking of old power and older blood. Around it clustered the homes of his warriors, the workshops of craftsmen, and the simple dwellings of thralls and farmers. Bjorn the smith was already at his forge, his massive frame silhouetted against the red glow of burning coals. He looked up as she approached and raised one soot-blackened hand in greeting. She nodded back, their usual morning ritual. He never expected words from her, never tried to force conversation. In his simple way, he respected her silence. "Morning, little ghost," he said softly, using the name the children had given her. "Astrid's waiting for you. Says there's something you need to see." Ingrid tilted her head questioningly, but Bjorn just shrugged his broad shoulders and returned to his work. She made her way toward Astrid's hut, which sat apart from the others near the edge of the forest. The old woman preferred her privacy, claiming the trees whispered secrets that only healers should hear. She found Astrid grinding something aromatic in her stone mortar, silver hair braided with small bones and carved runes. The elder looked up with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. "Ah, child, come sit. We have much to discuss." Astrid gestured toward a wooden stool beside her work table. "The ravens brought news in the night. Rurik returns to us. Ingrid's blood turned to ice. She had heard the name whispered in dark corners for 3 years now. Rurik the Bear, the giant who had killed his own brother in a duel over honor and been exiled for it. Some said he had died in the wilderness. Others claimed he had joined the crews sailing west to raid the Saxon lands. All agreed he was better off gone. The Jarl's men spotted his ship on the morning tide, Astrid continued, watching Ingrid's face carefully. He comes alone under a banner of truce. Gunnar must receive him. The old laws demand it. But that doesn't mean anyone wants him here. Ingrid managed to keep her expression neutral, but inside her mind raced. She had been barely 15 when Rurik left, but she remembered him well. A mountain of a man with pale eyes like winter ice and arms that could split shields. He had been different from the others somehow, quieter despite his fearsome reputation. She recalled seeing him once, tending to a wounded dog with surprising gentleness. "Why are you telling me this?" The question formed in her mind but never reached her lips. Instead, she simply looked at Astrid with raised eyebrows. The old woman smiled knowingly. "Because, my dear child, some men see more than others. And Rurik sees everything." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Be careful around him. Your silence has protected you from many things, but it will not protect you from those who truly understand what silence means." Before Ingrid could react, the sound of horns echoed across the village, the call that announced important arrivals. Both women moved to the small window and peered toward the harbor. A single longship cut through the morning mist, its black sail bearing the image of a white bear. At the prow stood a figure that seemed carved from stone and legend, Rurik Ironsson, returned from the dead. Even at this distance, Ingrid could see he had grown larger in exile, his shoulders broader, his presence more commanding. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his bearing that struck her most, the way he stood perfectly still, while the ship moved beneath him, as if he were the calm center around which the world turned. "By Thor's hammer," Astrid breathed. "Look at the size of him." The ship reached the dock, and Rurik stepped onto the wooden planking with fluid grace, despite his massive frame. He wore simple traveling clothes, leather and wool dyed dark brown, but the great war axe strapped to his back spoke of the violence he carried within him. The weapon was legendary, forged by masters and marked with the scars of countless battles. Men called it Wormbane, the serpent killer, and it had drunk the blood of more enemies than most warriors ever faced. Villagers gathered in the square as word spread, their voices a mix of excitement and apprehension. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts, while the men fingered their own weapons nervously. Everyone remembered the last time Rurik had walked these streets. Jarl Gunnar emerged from his longhouse with his retinue, his grey beard carefully braided and his finest clothes displayed. His son Eric walked beside him, hand resting on his sword hilt, jaw set with the arrogance of youth. The family resemblance was strong. Both shared the same sharp features and calculating eyes that had made them successful leaders and dangerous enemies. "Rurik Ironsson," Gunnar called out, his voice carrying across the square. 3 years have you been gone from us. By what right do you return?" Rurik's response carried even further, his deep voice seeming to resonate from his massive chest. "By the right of blood and birth, Jarl Gunnar. This was my father's village before it was yours. I claim guest right and the chance to speak my piece." "Guest right is yours," Gunnar replied formally, though his eyes remained cold. "But know this, your exile was justly given. The blood of your brother still cries out for justice. My brother died in fair combat, as was his choice." Rurik's voice held no apology, no hint of regret. "I seek no quarrel with any man here, only the chance to live out my days in the land of my birth." The crowd murmured at this. Many had expected him to come seeking revenge or conquest. The idea that the fearsome Rurik the Bear simply wanted to come home seemed almost anticlimactic. Eric stepped forward, his young face twisted with suspicion. "And what of those who wronged you before your exile? Do you forgive all debts and slights?" For the first time, Rurick's ice-blue eyes swept the crowd, and Ingrid felt her breath catch as his gaze passed over her. For just a moment, so brief she might have imagined it, his eyes seemed to linger on her face. Then he looked back at Eric with something that might have been amusement. "I remember everything, boy. But a man who lives in the past dies in the present. I have learned much in my years away, including the value of patience." Astrid's hand found Ingrid's arm, her grip tight with warning. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "The way he looked at you?" As if he knew, but Ingrid was already backing away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. In that brief moment when their eyes had met, she had seen something that terrified her more than Eric's crude advances or Gunnar's political schemes. She had seen recognition, not the recognition of a man noticing a pretty face or remembering a village girl from years past. This was deeper, more dangerous. It was the recognition of one secret keeper spotting another, of a predator identifying prey that had been hiding in plain sight. "I should go," she managed to communicate through gestures, pointing toward the forest where her morning herb gathering usually took her. "Yes," Astrid agreed quietly. "That would be wise. But child," she caught Ingrid's hand as she turned to leave. "Running will only confirm what he already suspects. Better to face the wolf than show him your back." But Ingrid was already moving, slipping out through the hut's back entrance and into the safety of the trees. Behind her, she could hear the formal words of welcome continuing, the ritual phrases that would bind Rurik to peace while he remained under Gunnar's roof. She didn't stop moving until she reached her favorite gathering spot, a small clearing beside a stream where the morning light filtered through ancient pines. Only then did she allow herself to truly breathe, to process what had just happened. For 8 years, her silence had been perfect armor. No one questioned the mute healer's daughter. No one looked too closely at her movements or wondered what thoughts lay behind her careful expressions. She had been invisible, protected by their assumptions and pity, but Rurik had seen through it all in a single glance. As she knelt beside the stream and began gathering the watermint that grew along its banks, Ingrid tried to convince herself she was overreacting. Perhaps it had been mere curiosity, the natural interest of a returning exile in how the village had changed. Perhaps she was imagining connections that didn't exist, but deep in her heart she knew better. The way he had looked at her, it was the same way she sometimes looked at others, when she caught them in small lies or petty deceptions. It was the gaze of someone who understood masks because he wore them himself. The question now was what he intended to do with that knowledge. Ingrid filled her herb pouch with steady hands, forcing her movements to remain calm and purposeful. Whatever came next, she would face it as she had faced everything else, with patience, preparation, and the quiet strength that had kept her free for 8 long years. But as she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that those years of freedom were rapidly coming to an end. 3 days passed like a held breath. Ingrid moved through her routines with careful precision, tending wounds, gathering herbs, grinding remedies in Astrid's mortar while the old woman watched her with knowing eyes. But beneath the familiar rhythms of village life, tension crackled like lightning before a storm. Rurik had taken residence in the abandoned blacksmith's cottage at the village's edge, a deliberate choice that spoke of both humility and strategy. Close enough to be part of the community, far enough to avoid unnecessary friction. He worked the neglected forge with surprising skill, the ring of hammer on metal echoing across Ravenshollow from dawn to dusk. Ingrid had managed to avoid him completely, taking longer routes to her gathering spots and timing her movements to when he was most likely to be occupied. But avoidance, she was beginning to learn, was merely postponing the inevitable. The confrontation came on the 4th morning, when young Gunther, barely 8 years old and always climbing things he shouldn't, fell from the roof of the grain storehouse and landed with a sickening crack. Ingrid was in Astrid's garden when the screams started. She dropped her basket of freshly picked comfrey and ran toward the sound, her healer's instincts overriding every careful precaution. By the time she reached the scene, a crowd had gathered around the boy's still form. "Don't move him!" Astrid's voice cut through the panic. "His leg. Look at how it bends." The bone had snapped cleanly, pushing against the skin in a way that made several onlookers turn away. Gunther's face was pale as snow, his breathing shallow and rapid. His mother knelt beside him, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Please," she begged, looking between Astrid and Ingrid. "Please save him." Astrid's gnarled hands moved carefully over the injury, her expression grim. "The bone is clean, but it must be set properly, or he'll never walk right again. Ingrid, we need your steady hands and the bone-setting tools from my hut." Ingrid nodded and turned to run back for the supplies, but as she spun around, she nearly collided with a wall of leather and muscle. Rurick stood directly behind her, his pale eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her stomach clench. "I can carry the boy to safety," he said quietly, his deep voice somehow cutting through the chaos without being raised. "These stones are no place for delicate work." For a moment everyone stared at him. In the 3 days since his return, most villagers had given him a wide berth, uncertain how to treat the exile who was no longer quite an exile. But here he was, offering help when a child's life hung in the balance. "Yes," Astrid said immediately. "Yes, that would be wise. The softest bed in my hut and mine the leg." Rurik knelt beside the boy with surprising gentleness for such a large man, his massive hands moving with the careful precision of someone who had handled many wounded. As he lifted Gunther, supporting the broken leg with practiced ease, his eyes met Ingrid's again. "You know what needs to be done," he said, and though his words seemed meant for everyone present, she heard the deeper meaning beneath them. Sometimes staying silent isn't an option. Ingrid's blood turned cold, but she forced herself to nod and hurry back to Astrid's hut. Her hands shook as she gathered the bone-setting tools, thin wooden splints, leather bindings, and the small vial of concentrated poppy extract they saved for the worst injuries. When she returned, she found Rurick had laid the boy on Astrid's sleeping platform, positioned perfectly for the delicate work ahead. He stood nearby, his presence somehow both reassuring and deeply unsettling. "Good," Astrid said, taking the supplies from Ingrid's trembling hands. "Now, child, I need you to—" The words died in her throat as a complication revealed itself. The broken bone had shifted during the move, and a fragment was now dangerously close to what looked like a major blood vessel. What had seemed like a straightforward break was now a crisis that could cost the boy his leg or his life. Astrid's hands hovered over the injury, uncertainty written across her weathered features. "I've never seen one quite like this," she admitted quietly. "The angle is wrong, and if we move the bone the wrong way, you'll sever the vessel." Rurick's voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "I've seen similar injuries on the battlefield. The trick is to manipulate the smaller fragment first, easing it away from the blood flow before addressing the main break." All eyes turned to him. Astrid's expression was troubled. "You have experience with such things?" "More than I care to remember." Rurick's pale eyes found Ingrid's face again. "But it requires 2 people, one to hold the leg steady, another to guide the bone back into position. The person guiding must have steady hands and perfect understanding of what they're feeling." The implication hung heavy in the air. Astrid's hands, skilled as they were, had begun to shake with age. The work required someone younger, with finer motor control and deeper sensitivity to the subtle resistance of bone and tissue. Someone like Ingrid. "I can't," Astrid said finally, her voice thick with frustration. "My hands aren't what they once were. The boy needs someone with a lighter touch." The silence stretched like a taut rope. Gunther's breathing grew more labored, his skin taking on a greyish pallor that spoke of shock setting in. His mother pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. "Ingrid," Rurik said quietly, and the use of her name, her actual name, spoken aloud for the first time in years, hit her like a physical blow. "The boy is dying." She stared at him, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. He knew, he had always known. The question was whether he would destroy her secret or force her to destroy it herself. She can't speak, Astrid said desperately. How can she guide such delicate work without words? Can't? Rurick's voice carried a note of gentle challenge. Or won't? The moments stretched between them like a blade's edge. Ingrid looked at the dying boy, at his mother's tear-streaked face, at Astrid's desperate expression. Then she looked at Rurick, whose pale eyes held not cruelty or satisfaction, but something that might have been understanding. 8 years of careful silence. 8 years of safety purchased with deception. 8 years of hiding from men who would claim her like property, but this was a child's life. Tell me what to do, she said quietly. Her voice rusty from disuse, but clear and strong. The effect on the room was electric. Astrid gasped, nearly dropping her tools. Several villagers who had crowded into the hut stumbled backward, as if they'd witnessed a miracle. Gunther's mother looked up with eyes wide as saucers, but Rurick simply nodded, as if he'd been expecting this moment all along. Good, he said calmly. Now place your hands here and here. Feel for the smaller fragment. It will resist pressure from this direction, but yield if you approach it from... For the next hour, Ingrid followed his quiet instructions, her hands guided by his deep knowledge of battlefield injuries. Together, they eased the broken bone back into proper alignment, splinted the leg with expert precision, and administered just enough poppy extract to ease the boy's pain without endangering his breathing. When it was over, Gunther slept peacefully, his color already improving. His leg would heal straight and strong, leaving him with nothing worse than a scar and a story to tell his own children someday. But Ingrid's world had changed forever. As the crowd dispersed, carrying news of the miracle they'd witnessed, she found herself alone with Rurick in Astrid's garden. The old woman had tactfully withdrawn to tend to other patients, leaving them to face what came next. How long have you known? Ingrid asked, her voice still strange to her own ears, after so many years of silence. From the moment I saw you, Rurick replied honestly. Your eyes give you away. They're too intelligent, too aware. A truly mute person develops different ways of seeing the world. You see it like someone who chooses not to speak, not someone who cannot. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm afternoon sun. What do you want from me? Nothing, he said simply. Your secret was yours to keep or reveal. I merely provided the circumstances where keeping it meant letting a child die. And now? Now that half the village heard me speak? Rurick's expression grew thoughtful. Now you discover what kind of men surround you. Some will respect what you've done today. Others, he paused, his eyes growing hard. Others will see opportunity in your newfound voice. As if summoned by his words, footsteps approached through the garden. Erik Gunnarsson emerged from behind the herb beds, his handsome face wearing an expression of predatory satisfaction. Well, well, he said, his voice carrying the same cruel hunger she remembered from 8 years ago. Look what the cat has finally dragged back to life. All these years we thought you were touched by the gods. It turns out you were just being stubborn. Ingrid felt the old terror rising in her throat, but before she could step backward, Rurick moved. Not aggressively, he simply shifted his position so that he stood between her and Erik, his massive frame casting the younger man in shadow. Something you needed, Erik. Rurick's voice was perfectly pleasant, but there was something underneath it that made Erik's confident smile falter slightly. Just welcoming our little songbird back to the world of the speaking, Erik replied, but his eyes never left Ingrid's face. We have much to discuss, don't we, Ingrid? About the past and about the future. The threat was clear, and Ingrid realized with crystalline clarity that her 8 years of safety were truly over. By saving Gunther's life, she had exposed herself to the very danger she'd spent nearly a decade avoiding. The question now was whether the protection of one dangerous man was worth the price it would surely demand. The news of Ingrid's voice spread through Ravenshollow like wildfire in dry grass. By evening, every soul in the village knew that the mute healer's daughter had spoken, that she had worked alongside the exile Rurik to save young Gunther's life, and that everything they thought they knew about her had been a lie. Ingrid sat in Astrid's hut as darkness fell, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea that had long since gone cold. Through the small window, she could see the warm glow of fires in the village below, could hear the murmur of voices discussing her fate. Some spoke with wonder, others with suspicion, and a few with the kind of calculating interest that made her stomach clench. "You can't stay here tonight," Astrid said quietly, settling into her chair with a grunt of old joints. "Eric's been asking questions, sniffing around like a hound on a scent. His father will want to speak with you come morning." "What kind of questions?" Ingrid's voice still felt foreign in her throat, each word requiring conscious effort after so many years of silence, the kind you'd expect from a man who spent 8 years believing he was denied what he considered rightfully his. Astrid's weathered face was grave in the flickering candlelight. "He wants to know if your silence was truly touched by the gods, or if it was deception. If deception, then what else might you have deceived them about?" Ingrid closed her eyes, feeling the weight of inevitability settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She had always known this day might come, had tried to prepare herself for it, but the reality was far more frightening than her imaginings. "There's something else," Astrid continued, her voice dropping even lower. "Old Sigrid was spreading tales in the market square. She claims she always suspected you could speak, says she caught you humming to yourself while gathering herbs last summer." "That's impossible." Ingrid's eyes snapped open. "I've never—" "Of course you haven't. But truth matters less than belief, child. If enough people convince themselves they always knew, then your deception becomes not just personal survival, but an insult to the entire village." Astrid leaned forward, her eyes reflecting the candle's flame. "They'll want answers, and they'll want them in front of the Jarl." A soft knock at the door interrupted them, barely audible above the wind that had begun to howl through the pines. Both women froze, listening. The knock came again, patient and deliberate. Astrid rose slowly, her hand moving to the iron dagger she kept beside her mortar. "Who calls at this hour?" "A friend," came Rurick's deep voice from beyond the door. "If you'll have me," Astrid looked at Ingrid, who nodded reluctantly. The old woman lifted the wooden bar and opened the door just wide enough to peer out. Rurick stood in the shadows, his massive frame wrapped in a dark cloak against the evening chill. "What do you want?" Astrid asked bluntly. "To offer protection to someone who will need it before this night is through." Rurick's pale eyes found Ingrid's across the room. "Eric Gunnison gathers men as we speak. He claims the right of investigation into deceptions practiced against the Jarl's peace." Ingrid felt her blood turn to ice. She knew what that meant. Eric was manufacturing legal justification for actions he'd wanted to take for 8 years. When she was brought before his father under suspicion of deliberate deception, anything that followed could be painted as justice rather than personal vengeance. "You could have stayed silent," Astrid said to Rurick, her voice sharp with accusation. "Could have let her secret remain hidden, and let the boy die?" Rurick's response was quiet but firm. "Would that have been kinder? To preserve a lie at the cost of a life?" "It would have been safer," Ingrid said, surprising herself with the bitterness in her voice. "For everyone." Rurick stepped into the hut, and suddenly the space felt much smaller. He moved with the careful grace of a large man, accustomed to enclosed spaces, but his presence seemed to fill every corner. "Safety built on lies has a way of crumbling at the worst possible moment," he said. "Better to face truth on your own terms than have it forced upon you by others." Easy words from someone who forced that choice. Ingrid shot back, anger flaring hotter than fear for the first time in years. "You could have found another way to save Gunther. Could have let Astrid try, could have sent for another healer. Instead, you chose to expose me." "Yes," Rurick said simply. "I did." His honesty caught her off guard. She had expected denials, justifications, perhaps even apologies. Instead, he simply acknowledged what he had done and waited for her response. Why? The question came out smaller than she intended, less accusation than genuine curiosity. Rurik was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying her face in the candlelight. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain that she hadn't expected. "Because I spent 3 years in exile, telling myself that surviving was worth any price, that hiding from truth was better than facing it." And I learned that a man who lives in shadows becomes a shadow himself, neither fully alive nor properly dead. He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. You deserved better than that half-life. That wasn't your choice to make, Ingrid said, but some of the anger had gone out of her voice. No, he agreed. It wasn't. But when I saw you moving through this village like a ghost, speaking to no one, touched by no one, I recognized something I had been myself. And I thought, perhaps hoped, that you had the courage I had lacked. Courage? Ingrid laughed, but there was no humor in it. Is that what you call it? I was terrified. I'm terrified. Good, Rurick said, and the unexpected response made her blink in surprise. Fear keeps you sharp, but terror can be faced, while slow death by hiding cannot be undone. Before Ingrid could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from outside, multiple sets, moving with purpose through the darkness. Astrid moved quickly to blow out the candle, plunging the hut into shadows, broken only by the faint glow of embers in the hearth. They come, Rurik murmured, his hand moving to the great axe strapped across his back. But he made no move to draw it, not yet. 3 of them, Astrid whispered, her ear pressed to the door. Eric's voice, and 2 others. The footsteps stopped outside the hut. For a moment, all was silent, except for the wind in the pines and the distant crash of waves against the rocky shore. Then Eric's voice cut through the night, loud enough to be heard by anyone within 100 paces, a deliberate choice that would ensure witnesses to whatever followed. Astrid, old woman, send out the deceiver. My father would speak with her about the lies she has told, the mockery she has made of our hospitality. Astrid looked between Ingrid and Rurik, her expression torn. Legally, Eric had the right to demand answers. The Jarl's justice was absolute within the village bounds, and resisting it would bring consequences for everyone involved. But Rurik stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the door entirely. Tell Eric Gunnarsson, he called out, his voice carrying easily through the wooden walls, that Ingrid, Astrid's daughter, is under my protection this night. If his father wishes to speak with her, he may request an audience in the morning, like a civilized man. The silence that followed was pregnant with tension. Eric's response, when it came, carried the promise of violence barely held in check. And by what right do you claim protection over her, exile? You who have no standing in this village, no voice in our justice? Rurik's answer was simple, direct, and utterly unexpected. By right of intention to wed. I claim Ingrid as my intended bride, and invoke the protection that such a claim provides under the old laws. Ingrid's world tilted sideways. Behind her, she heard Astrid's sharp intake of breath. Outside, even the wind seemed to pause as the implications of Rurik's declaration settled over them all like snow. She opened her mouth to protest, to deny, to demand an explanation. But Rurik's pale eyes caught hers in the dim light, and she saw something there that made the words die in her throat. Not possession or dominance, but a question. A choice offered in the only way possible under the circumstances: accept his protection and the marriage that would inevitably follow, or face Eric's justice alone. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Ingrid stared at Rurik, her mind reeling from his declaration. Marriage intention. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, carrying implications that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. Outside, she could hear Eric conferring with his companions in low, urgent whispers. The old laws were clear on such matters. A woman under marriage protection could not be claimed by another man without blood being spilled. It was a safeguard from older, more brutal times. But it still held force in their isolated village. You cannot be serious, Ingrid whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Rurik's expression remained calm. But she caught something flickering in his pale eyes, uncertainty. Perhaps, or regret for the choice he'd forced upon them both. The alternative is worse, he said simply. Is it? Her voice rose slightly, 8 years of suppressed emotion bleeding through. How do I know you won't be just another man seeking to own what he cannot have? How do I know this protection won't become another cage? Before Rurik could answer, Eric's voice boomed through the night again, carrying a note of triumph that made Ingrid's skin crawl. Marriage intention, is it? How convenient that such an intention should arise tonight of all nights. His tone dripped with mockery. Tell me, Rurik the Bear, when exactly did you decide to claim the mute girl? Before or after you discovered she could speak? Rurik moved closer to the door, his hand now resting openly on the handle of his great axe. The weapon seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the dim light. Its iron head was scored with countless battle marks, and the wooden handle was worn smooth by years of use. This was blood hunger, she realized with a start, remembering the weapon's true name from village stories. It had belonged to his father and his father's father, each generation adding to its legacy of violence. My intentions toward Ingrid are my own concern, Rurik replied, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. If you question them, you question my honor. We both know where such questions lead. The threat was clear. Eric might have legal justification for his actions tonight, but challenging a man's honor was another matter entirely, one that could only be settled with steel. Perhaps, Eric said after a pause, and Ingrid could hear the calculating mind working behind his words. But marriage intentions must be declared before witnesses, must they not? And the woman in question must give her consent freely, without coercion. Astrid moved to Ingrid's side, her weathered hand finding the younger woman's shoulder. He's not wrong, she whispered. The old laws require your voice in this matter. Ingrid felt trapped between crushing stones. She looked at Rurik's broad back as he faced the door, at the confident set of his shoulders that spoke of a man accustomed to violence. Then she thought of Eric's cruel smile, of the hunger that had lurked in his eyes for 8 years, of the justice he would dispense if she walked out that door alone. 2 predators, each offering their own form of protection and their own price. What assurance do I have? She asked Rurik quietly. What guarantee that your protection won't simply be slower form of the same imprisonment? He turned then, and in his pale eyes she saw something unexpected. A deep weariness that spoke of battles fought not just with sword and axe, but with conscience and regret. None, he said honestly. I cannot promise to be other than what I am, but I can promise this. I have never taken what was not freely given, and I will not start with you. Pretty words, Ingrid said, but she found herself studying his face for signs of deception. After 8 years of reading people through their expressions and gestures, she had become skilled at spotting lies. What she saw in Rurik's features was not the smooth confidence of a practiced deceiver, but the rough honesty of a man who had given up pretense. Eric. Came a new voice from outside, older, more authoritative. Jarl Gunnar himself had arrived. What is the meaning of this disturbance? Father, Eric's voice carried a note of forced respect. I seek to question the woman Ingrid about deceptions practiced against our hospitality. But the exile claims marriage intention and denies us access to her. Marriage intention. Gunnar's voice sharpened with interest. Rurik, is this true? It is, Jarl, Rurik called back. I claim Ingrid Astridsdottir as my intended bride and invoke the protection such a claim provides. This is convenient timing, Gunnar observed, his tone neutral but carrying an undertone of suspicion. Such intentions are usually declared in daylight, before the community. Unusual circumstances require unusual measures, Rurik replied. Would you have me let your son drag her from her refuge in the middle of the night like a common thrall? The insult was subtle but pointed, implying that Eric's methods were dishonorable beneath the dignity of a Jarl's son. Ingrid heard the sharp intake of breath from outside, and knew that the barb had found its mark. My son acts within his rights, Gunnar said carefully. But so do you if your claim is genuine. However, his voice grew harder. Marriage intentions must be confirmed by the woman herself. We would hear her voice in this matter. Ingrid closed her eyes, feeling the weight of decision settling on her shoulders like armor she'd never wanted to wear. When she opened them again, she found Rurik watching her with an expression of careful neutrality, offering no pressure, no plea, only patient waiting for her choice. It was that patience, Perhaps that decided her. Eric would never have given her time to think, would never have offered a choice at all. "I need terms," she said quietly, but her voice carried clearly in the still night air. Rurick nodded slowly. "Speak them. If I accept your protection, if I agree to this intention of marriage, it remains only an intention until I choose otherwise. You will not force the matter, will not use physical strength or legal maneuvering to bind me before I am ready." "Agreed," Rurick said without hesitation. "I retain my work as a healer. My freedom to move through the village is needed for that work." "Agreed. And if I find that your protection is simply another form of captivity, if you prove to be no better than those you protect me from, I may withdraw my consent and you will not pursue the matter further." This time Rurick hesitated, and Ingrid saw something flicker across his features that might have been pain. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "That is a harder bargain. It means trusting you to judge fairly when the time comes, trusting that you will see clearly, despite whatever prejudices you may hold against men like me." "Men like you?" Ingrid asked. "Men who have done violence. Men who carry blood on their hands and scars on their souls." His pale eyes met hers directly. "Men who have made choices they cannot unmake." For a moment the hut was utterly still, except for the crackling of embers in the hearth. Then Ingrid nodded slowly. "I accept those terms," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. "And I accept yours," Rurick replied formally. Then louder, addressing those waiting outside, "Jarl Gunnar, you have heard the lady's consent freely given. I claim Ingrid Astridsdottir as my intended bride and invoke all protections such a claim provides under the old laws." The response came swiftly, Eric's voice tight with barely controlled fury. "This is far from over, exile. Marriage intentions can be challenged. Blood debts can be called. You may have won tonight, but winter is long and spring is far away." Footsteps retreated into the darkness, but Ingrid knew the threat was real. She had gained protection, perhaps, but at the cost of making enemies who would not forget or forgive. As the sounds of departure faded into the night, she found herself alone with Rurik and Astrid, bound by words spoken in desperation to a man she barely knew. The question now was whether she had chosen the lesser of two evils, or simply exchanged one trap for another. Dawn came grey and cold, painting the village in shades of ash and silver. Ingrid had slept little, her mind churning over the events of the night and the bargain she had struck. When she finally emerged from Astrid's hut, the morning mist seemed to carry whispers, voices that grew quiet as she passed, eyes that followed her movement with new intensity. The village had changed overnight, or perhaps she was seeing it clearly for the first time. Where once she had moved invisible through the daily routines, now every step felt watched, weighed, judged. Children peered at her from behind their mothers' skirts, their eyes wide with the wonder of witnessing someone they'd thought mute suddenly speak. The adults were less innocent in their staring. She caught speculation in their glances, calculations of what her deception might mean for alliances and feuds that had simmered for years. She made her way to Bjorn's forge, where the blacksmith worked bellows with steady rhythm. He looked up as she approached, his soot-streaked face breaking into a careful smile. "Morning, Ingrid," he said, using her name for the first time since her childhood. "Heard you found your voice again. About time, I'd say. You're not angry." She found herself surprised by the question. That I deceived everyone for so long? Bjorn set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his leather apron. "Angry? Girl, I've got eyes. Seen what happens to pretty young women in this village when certain men take notice. Always figured you had your reasons." He paused, studying her face. "Question is, was marrying the bear the best solution?" Before she could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Rurik emerged from the morning mist like a figure from legend, his massive frame moving with surprising grace across the uneven ground. He wore simple work clothes, wool and leather dyed the brown of rich earth, but the great axe across his back marked him as what he was. "A killer trained from birth, Bjorn," he said with a respectful nod to the blacksmith. "Ingrid? Rurik, Bjorn's tone was carefully neutral. Heard congratulations might be in order. Perhaps, Rurik replied, his pale eyes finding Ingrid's face. That depends on many things yet to be decided. The honesty of his response seemed to surprise the blacksmith. Most men would have claimed certainty, would have spoken of their intended bride as already won. But Rurick's words acknowledged the fragile nature of their arrangement. I came to invite you to see my forge, Rurik continued, addressing Ingrid directly. If we're to share a life, or at least consider it, you should know how I intend to make my living. Ingrid glanced at Bjorn, who shrugged. His metalwork is sound, the older smith admitted grudgingly. Better than sound, if I'm honest. Men's got a gift for it. They walked in silence toward the small cottage Rurik had claimed at the village's edge. The building sat apart from the others, surrounded by ancient pines that whispered secrets in the morning breeze. Smoke rose from the forge chimney, and the air carried the scent of burning charcoal and hot iron. Inside, Ingrid found herself impressed despite her reservations. The workspace was organized with military precision, tools arranged by size and function, materials sorted and stored with care. The forge itself burned clean and hot, and the anvil showed signs of recent use, but it was what hung on the walls that truly caught her attention. "You made these?" she asked, moving closer to examine a set of surgical instruments that gleamed in the firelight, among other things. Rurik picked up one of the pieces, a delicate probe no thicker than a needle but perfectly balanced. I spent time among Arab traders during my exile, learned that metalwork could serve purposes other than killing. The instruments were beautiful in their precision, scalpels sharp enough to split hairs, forceps that closed with perfect alignment, probes and extractors that spoke of deep understanding of a healer's needs. This was the artifact she hadn't expected to find here, surgical tools that represented transformation, the potential for creation rather than destruction. "You studied healing?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. "I studied many things while trying to forget what I was." Rurik's voice carried a note of old pain. "A man in exile has time to think, to question whether the only value of strong hands is the damage they can do." Ingrid picked up one of the scalpels, testing its weight and balance. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, better than anything she'd seen in Astrid's collection, superior even to tools carried by traveling healers from the southern kingdoms. "Why show me this?" she asked. "Because you should know what kind of man asks for your hand." Rurik moved to the forge, using tongs to adjust the burning charcoal. "I'm not only the bear who kills. I'm also someone who has learned to create, to heal, to serve purposes greater than his own hunger for violence. And which man am I marrying?" The question came out more direct than she'd intended. Rurik was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes reflecting the fire's glow. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, measured, both, I think. The skills that make a man deadly in battle can also make him precise in healing. The patience required to forge good steel is the same patience needed to mend what is broken. He paused, setting down his tools. "The question is whether you can accept a man who carries both capabilities within him." Before Ingrid could respond, voices outside the forge grew loud enough to penetrate the thick walls. She recognized Eric's tone immediately, sharp with authority and barely contained anger. No right to hide behind ancient laws. "The village has questions that need answers." Rurick moved to the small window, his expression growing grim. "Eric brings friends today, more than yesterday." Ingrid joined him at the window, peering through the crude glass. A group of 6 men stood in the clearing before the cottage, Eric at their center like a wolf leading his pack. She recognized most of them, younger warriors who had served under Eric's command during recent raids, men whose loyalty was purchased with promises of future rewards. "What do they want?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "To test the strength of our arrangement," Rurik replied. "To see if I'm truly willing to fight for what I've claimed." "And are you?" Rurik's hand moved to the handle of the great axe across his back, his fingers wrapping around the worn leather with familiar ease. "That depends. Are you worth fighting for?" The question struck her like a physical blow. After 8 years of hiding, of making herself small and invisible. The idea that someone might consider her worth violence was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "Then we'll find out together," Rurick said, and stepped toward the door. Outside, Eric's voice rose in formal challenge. "Rurik Ironsson, come forth and answer for the deceptions you harbor." Rurik paused at the threshold, looking back at Ingrid. "Whatever happens next, remember, you chose this path as much as I did. If you wish to withdraw your consent, now would be the time." Ingrid looked at the surgical instruments gleaming on his workbench, thought of the precision and care required to create such delicate tools. Then she thought of Eric's cruel smile, of 8 years spent in fearful silence, of the child whose life had been saved by her willingness to finally speak. "No," she said firmly. "I stand by our bargain." Rurik nodded once, then pushed open the door to face whatever waited outside. The confrontation unfolded like a ritual dance, each man knowing his steps but uncertain of the ending. Eric stood at the center of his group, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt, while his companions spread out in a loose semicircle. They had chosen their ground carefully, close enough to the village center to ensure witnesses, far enough from the main buildings to avoid immediate intervention from the Jarl. Rurik emerged from his forge with the measured calm of a man who had faced such moments countless times before. His great axe remained strapped to his back, but his stance spoke of readiness, weight balanced, muscles loose. Pale eyes taking in every detail of the opposition. "Erik Gunnarsson," he said, his deep voice carrying easily across the clearing. "You seem troubled this morning." "Troubled?" Eric's laugh held no warmth. "I am concerned for the welfare of our community. When deceptions are practiced against our hospitality, when ancient laws are twisted for personal gain, these things trouble any man who cares for justice." "Justice," Rurik repeated thoughtfully. "An interesting word from someone who seeks to drag a woman from her refuge in the middle of the night." The barb struck home. Several of Eric's companions shifted uncomfortably, and Ingrid caught murmurs of agreement from villagers who had gathered at the edges of the clearing to watch the drama unfold. Eric's face darkened, but he maintained his composure. "The woman practiced deception for 8 years, he said, his voice rising to address the growing crowd. "She made fools of us all, took our pity, our protection, our care, all based on lies. Such deception demands answers, and those answers would be extracted how?" Rurik's question was quiet, but it cut through Eric's rhetoric like a blade. Through gentle questioning, through the kind of justice that leaves bruises and broken bones. "I would have questioned her properly," Eric snapped, his careful composure finally cracking. "According to law, according to tradition, according to your desires," Rurik interrupted, and now his voice carried the edge of real anger. "Tell me, Eric, in all your concern for justice, when did you plan to ask about her reasons? When did you intend to discover why a 14-year-old girl might choose silence over speech?" The question hung in the air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Around the clearing, villagers who had been murmuring fell silent. Even Eric's companions seemed suddenly uncomfortable, their earlier confidence wavering. Ingrid felt her breath catch. Rurik's words laid bare the truth she had hidden for so long, not just that she had deceived them, but why that deception had been necessary. She had been a child, barely past her first bleeding, when Eric had tried to claim her. The memory still made her stomach clench with remembered terror. "That," Eric began, but Rurik wasn't finished. "Or perhaps," the big man continued, his voice growing dangerously quiet, "you already know the answer to that question. Perhaps you remember exactly why a young girl might choose to hide her voice rather than speak it in your presence. The silence that followed was absolute." Eric's face had gone pale except for 2 spots of color high on his cheeks. Around the clearing, understanding began to dawn on faces that had previously shown only curiosity or disapproval. "You accuse me," Eric started, his hand tightening on his sword. "I accuse no one," Rurik said calmly. "I merely ask questions, the same kind of questions you claim the right to ask of others." It was a masterful response, Ingrid realized. Rurick had turned Eric's own justification against him, using the younger man's demand for truth to expose truths Eric would rather keep buried. But it was also dangerous. Backing a proud man into a corner often led to violence, and Eric had 6 armed companions to Rurick's 1. "Enough!" came a new voice from the crowd. Jarl Gunnar pushed through the gathered villagers, his weathered face grave with authority. "This spectacle serves no one." "Father," Eric said quickly, I heard what you were doing," Gunnar cut him off. "And I heard what was said in response." The Jarl's eyes moved between his son and the exile, weighing words and implications with the careful judgment of a man who had ruled for 30 years. "These are serious matters, requiring serious consideration." "Indeed they are," agreed a voice from behind the Jarl. Astrid emerged from the crowd, leaning heavily on a walking stick that Ingrid had never seen her use before. The old woman moved with deliberate slowness, but her eyes were sharp as flint. Perhaps it's time for the whole truth to be spoken. In her free hand, she carried something wrapped in dark cloth, a bundle about the size of a man's fist, but clearly heavy from the way she handled it. As she approached the center of the confrontation, she began to unwrap her burden. "Astrid," Gunnar said warningly, "what do you carry?" "Evidence," the old woman replied simply. "Something I have kept hidden for 8 years, waiting for the day when truth would be needed more than peace." The cloth fell away to reveal a carved wooden box, its surface dark with age and polished smooth by countless hands. Intricate knotwork covered its lid, the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of great value and greater significance. This was clearly an heirloom, something passed down through generations. "My grandmother's memory box," Astrid explained, her voice carrying clearly across the silent clearing. "Given to me by my mother, who received it from hers, back to the time when the old gods walked among us. It has always been used to preserve truth when lies threatened to destroy justice." She opened the box with careful hands, revealing its contents to the assembled crowd. Inside, nestled in faded silk, lay a piece of torn fabric, rough wool dyed the deep blue that marked a jarl's household. "This," Astrid said, lifting the fabric with reverent care, "was torn from a tunic 8 years ago, when a young girl fought off a man who tried to take what was not freely given." Eric's face went white as fresh snow. Around the clearing, villagers began to mutter among themselves, understanding dawning like sunrise after a long night. "She brought it to me," Astrid continued, her voice gaining strength. "Torn and bloodied, terrified that no one would believe her word against that of a jarl's son. I told her to stay silent, to let the matter pass, that speaking out would only bring her more harm." "You lie," Eric said, but his voice cracked like a boy's. "Do I?" Astrid held up the fabric so all could see. "Then explain how I came to possess a piece of your finest tunic, Eric Gunnarsson. Explain the bloodstains that still mark it, the tears that speak of struggle, the silence stretched taut as a bowstring." Eric looked around the clearing, seeking support from his companions, but found only uncomfortable stares and shifting feet. The weight of evidence and implication was too heavy to ignore. "Even if—" he began desperately, but Rurick's voice cut through his words like an axe through wood. "Even if what, Eric? Even if you tried to rape a 14-year-old girl? That gives you the right to question her now? Even if she chose 8 years of silence rather than face your justice, she should trust your mercy today." The word hung in the air like thunder. Rape. No one had spoken it directly before, but now it could not be taken back, could not be ignored or explained away. Eric's hand flew to his sword, but before he could draw steel, his father's voice cracked like a whip. "Stop!" Gunnar's command brooked no argument. There will be no blood spilled over words spoken in anger, but the damage was done. Truth, once released, could not be caged again. Around the clearing, Ingrid saw the change in how people looked at her, not with suspicion or accusation, but with understanding. 8 years of silence suddenly made perfect sense. She stepped forward, moving to stand beside Rurick for the first time since their arrangement began. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the assembled crowd. "I chose silence because it was safer than truth. I chose deception because it was kinder than justice. And I chose Rurick's protection because he offers what this village never has, the chance to speak without fear. The words felt like shedding armor she had worn too long. For the first time in 8 years, Ingrid stood in sunlight instead of shadow. Her true self revealed to the world that had demanded her silence. The question now was whether that world would accept what it had finally been forced to see. The revelation should have ended everything. Eric's shame laid bare, Ingrid's truth finally spoken. Justice served through exposure rather than violence. It felt like the conclusion of a saga told around winter fires. But as the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about what they had witnessed, Jarl Gunnar raised his hand for silence. "Wait," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of rule. "There is more that must be said." Something in his tone made Ingrid's stomach clench with unease. She glanced at Rurick, whose pale eyes had grown watchful, and at Astrid, whose weathered face showed the first hints of concern. "My son stands accused of grave crimes," Gunnar continued, his gaze fixed on the torn fabric in Astrid's hands. "If true, these accusations demand judgment according to our laws." But he paused, letting the word hang heavy in the morning air. "There are other laws at work here, older laws that some have forgotten." Eric, who had been standing frozen with shame and fury, suddenly straightened. A knowing look passed between father and son, and Ingrid felt her heart begin to race. "What laws?" Rurick asked, his hand drifting toward the axe across his back. Gunnar smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The law of bloodright, Rurik Ironson. The law that governs who may claim marriage intention in this village." The words hit like a physical blow. Ingrid felt the world tilt sideways as understanding crashed over her. She had been so focused on escaping Eric's immediate threat that she had forgotten the deeper currents of power that ran through their small community. "Explain yourself," Rurik demanded. But his voice had grown careful, controlled. "Gladly." Gunnar stepped forward, his presence suddenly dominating the clearing in a way that reminded everyone why he had ruled so long. "Ingrid is the daughter of Astrid the Healer, who served this community for 40 years. But before she was a healer, Astrid was wife to my brother Olaf, my younger brother, who died in a raid when the girl was barely walking." Astrid's face had gone ashen. "Gunnar, no. You cannot—" "Cannot what, sister?" "Cannot acknowledge family when it serves the good of the village." The Jarl's voice carried false warmth that made Ingrid's skin crawl. "Ingrid is my niece by blood, which makes her part of my household under the old laws. And under those same laws, members of a Jarl's household cannot be claimed in marriage without the Jarl's consent." The implications crashed down like an avalanche. If Ingrid was considered part of Gunnar's household, then her consent to Rurick's marriage intention meant nothing. The decision would rest entirely with the Jarl, Eric's father. "You never acknowledged this kinship before," Rurik said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Because it wasn't necessary before," Gunnar replied smoothly. Ingrid was mute, untouchable, blessed by the gods. There was no need to claim what no one else wanted. But now, he shrugged eloquently, now she has value. Now she requires proper protection within the family structure. Protection? Ingrid found her voice at last, anger burning through shock. "Is that what you call this? Another cage with prettier bars?" "I call it reality, niece." Gunnar's use of the familial term felt like a slap. "You are young, inexperienced in the ways of the world. You've allowed yourself to be influenced by a man whose reputation speaks of violence and betrayal. It is my duty as your kinsman to guide you toward better choices like your son." The words tasted bitter as wormwood. "Eric made a mistake," Gunnar said, his voice hardening. "A young man's error in judgment, nothing more. Such things can be forgiven, forgotten, overcome through proper marriage and the softening influence of a good wife." The audacity of it left Ingrid speechless. In one masterful stroke, Gunnar had transformed his son from accused rapist to wronged suitor, while simultaneously claiming authority over her future. It was political maneuvering of the highest order and utterly ruthless in its calculation. "This is monstrous!" Astrid said, her voice shaking with rage. You abandoned the girl for 8 years, never acknowledge her existence, never offer protection when she needed it, and now you claim kinship when it serves your purpose. I claim what has always been true, Gunnar replied calmly. Blood calls to blood, Astrid. You know this. And what of the law of marriage intention? Rurick asked. What of the protection I claimed and she accepted? Gunnar's smile grew predatory. Marriage intentions can be withdrawn when they are found to have been made without proper authority. Since Ingrid lacked the right to consent without my approval, your claim has no legal standing. But it does have practical standing, Rurik said quietly, and something in his tone made everyone in the clearing take notice. Because I still carry the axe that made such claims, and I am still the man who spoke them. The threat was clear, but Gunnar had prepared for this as well. At a subtle signal from the Jarl, more men emerged from the surrounding buildings. Not just Eric's companions, but seasoned warriors bearing the marks of long service. Within moments, Rurik found himself outnumbered 3-1. Violence would be unwise, Gunnar observed, particularly for a man seeking to rejoin our community. Such actions would mark you as an enemy of the village, subject to immediate exile or death. Rurik's hand tightened on his axe handle, but he made no move to draw the weapon. He was fearsome, but he wasn't stupid. Even he couldn't fight a dozen armed men and survive. However, Gunnar continued, his voice taking on the tone of reasonable compromise. I am not an unreasonable man. If you truly care for my niece's welfare, there are ways to serve that interest without challenging lawful authority. What ways? Ingrid asked, though she dreaded the answer. Simple. Renounce your marriage intention publicly, acknowledge my authority over your future as your kinsman, and accept betrothal to Eric with appropriate ceremony. In return, your past deceptions will be forgiven, your honor restored, and your position in the community secured. And if I refuse? Gunnar's expression grew sorrowful, but his eyes remained cold as winter ice. Then I would be forced to conclude that your long silence has affected your judgment, that you are not capable of making decisions for yourself. In such cases, the law is clear. A kinsman must act to protect his family member from harm, even from her own poor choices. The trap was perfect in its construction. Accept betrothal to Eric and gain the protection of acknowledged kinship, or refuse and be declared mentally incompetent, which would give Gunnar even more control over her fate. Either way, she would end up exactly where Eric wanted her. But as Ingrid stood there, feeling the walls closing in around her, she noticed something that Gunnar's careful planning hadn't accounted for. Astrid was reaching into her herb pouch with subtle movements, her fingers finding something that made her eyes brighten with sudden inspiration. There is another law, the old woman said quietly, her voice cutting through Gunnar's triumph like a blade. Older than blood right, older than kinship claims. The law of the gods themselves. She pulled her hand from the pouch, revealing a small vial filled with dark liquid that seemed to absorb the morning light. The glass was ancient, covered in runes that predated the village itself, and the liquid within moved like oil, mixed with shadow. The Truth-Seer's draught, Astrid announced, holding the vial up for all to see. One drop on the tongue and lies become impossible. Truth becomes compulsory. Let any who doubt Ingrid's words, or who question the justice of her choices, drink and speak their true intentions before the gods. The silence that followed was profound. Every person in the clearing knew the legends of the Truth-Seer's draught, the ancient brew that forced complete honesty from whoever consumed it. Most believed it was merely legend, but looking at the vial in Astrid's weathered hands, none were willing to test that belief. That's Eric began, but his voice cracked and died. Impossible. Astrid smiled grimly. Ancient? Dangerous? Yes, all of those things. But also real, and available to any who would prove their pure intentions toward this girl. Gunnar's face had gone pale. Astrid, such things are not what? Not convenient? Not part of your careful plans? The old woman's voice gained strength with each word. You speak of laws and kinship, of authority and protection. But the gods have their own laws, older and more binding than any Jarl's decree. She held the vial higher, letting the strange liquid catch what light it could. "Let Eric drink and speak his true intentions toward Ingrid. Let you speak your true reasons for claiming kinship now, after 8 years of abandonment. Let any man here prove his pure heart by accepting the god's judgment." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a sacrifice. Around the clearing, villagers watched with growing excitement as the political became spiritual, as human maneuvering gave way to divine trial. Eric took a step backward, his face white as bone. "This is madness. No one can prove such a draft is real." "Then drink it," Rurick said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like an axe through wood. "If it's merely legend, you have nothing to fear. If it's real, then let the gods judge between us." For a moment, Eric looked trapped between competing terrors, the draft that might expose his true nature, or the appearance of cowardice before the entire village. But it was Gunnar who provided the escape, stepping forward with the smooth authority of long practice. "Enough of this foolishness," he declared. "We are civilized people, not superstitious peasants who settle disputes with ancient potions. Ingrid will accept her proper place in my household, and that is the end of the matter." But Astrid was already moving, crossing the clearing with surprising speed for her age. Before anyone could react, she had reached Ingrid's side and pressed the vial into her hands. "The choice is yours, child," she whispered, but her words carried clearly in the morning stillness. "Face their laws, or invoke laws older than their grandfathers' grandfathers. But choose quickly. Courage delayed becomes cowardice confirmed." Ingrid stared down at the vial in her hands, feeling its weight and warmth against her palms. The liquid within seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and the runes carved into the glass felt hot against her fingers. Around her, the village held its breath, waiting to see whether she would submit to the world of men's laws or dare to invoke the judgment of the gods themselves. The vial seemed to burn against Ingrid's palms, its ancient glass warm as living flesh. Around her, the village held its collective breath, waiting to see whether she would submit to Gunnar's legal maneuvering or dare invoke the judgment of gods whose names were older than memory. "Don't be a fool. Girl," Gunnar said, his voice carrying paternal authority even as his eyes remained cold. "Put aside that superstitious nonsense and accept the protection your family offers." But Ingrid found herself studying the carved runes that spiraled around the vial's surface, recognizing some from the oldest healing songs Astrid had taught her. These weren't mere decorations, they were bindings, constraints that held whatever power slept within the dark liquid. "What does it actually do?" she asked Astrid quietly. The old woman's eyes never left Gunnar's face as she answered. "It strips away all pretense, all careful words and hidden meanings. Whoever drinks speaks only truth for one full day, not just avoiding lies, but compelled to voice what they truly think and feel." "That's barbaric," Eric said. But his voice cracked like a boy's. "No civilized person would what?" Rurick interrupted, his pale eyes fixed on Eric with predatory intensity. "Would submit to honest judgment, would let their true nature be revealed." "The risks are too great," Gunnar interjected smoothly. "Such ancient brews can drive men mad, can poison the mind as surely as the body. I cannot permit my niece to endanger herself with unknown substances." "How convenient," Astrid said dryly. "Your concern for her safety emerges precisely when it serves your interests." The verbal sparring might have continued indefinitely, but the arrival of new voices cut through the tension like a blade. A small group approached from the village center, elder women led by Sigrid the Wise, whose word carried weight even in councils of men. "What transpires here?" Sigrid asked, her sharp eyes taking in the assembled crowd, the vial in Ingrid's hands, the obvious tension crackling between the various factions. "Family matters," Gunnar replied carefully. "Nothing that concerns—" "Everything concerns us when it happens in the village square," Sigrid cut him off with the authority of age and respected wisdom. "Speak plainly, Jarl, what is this about?" The enforced explanation took several minutes, with various voices adding details and corrections. As the full scope of Gunnar's legal maneuvering became clear, Ingrid watched the elder women's faces grow increasingly grave. Blood right claim after 8 years of silence? Sigrid's voice carried sharp disapproval. And this sudden kinship emerges precisely when the girl finds her voice and chooses her own path. The law is clear, Gunnar insisted, but his tone had grown defensive. The law is many things, another elder woman replied. Clear is not always one of them. Sigrid approached Ingrid, her weathered hands gentle as she examined the ancient vial. And this? You would invoke the old ways? I don't know, Ingrid admitted. I don't even know if I believe they still have power. Belief is not required, Sigrid said quietly. Only courage. She turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying the authority of one who had seen 7 decades of village politics. If Jarl Gunnar claims blood right over this woman, and if she disputes that claim, then let the matter be settled according to the oldest laws. Let truth be tested by those willing to stake their honor on it. You cannot be serious, Gunnar protested. These are dangerous times for dangerous experiments. The village needs stability, not chaos born from ancient superstitions. The village needs justice, Sigrid replied firmly. And sometimes justice requires courage that our comfortable compromises have forgotten. She gestured toward the vial in Ingrid's hands. But the choice must be yours, child. No one can make it for you. Ingrid looked around the clearing, at Eric's pale, fearful face, at Gunnar's cold calculation, at Rurick's carefully controlled tension. Then her eyes found the small group of village women who had gathered behind Sigrid, and she saw something there that surprised her. Respect. Not pity, not protection, but the acknowledgement of one adult by others. If I drink this, she said slowly, what happens to those who refuse? Nothing, Astrid replied. The gods force truth from no one who will not offer it freely. But her smile was sharp as winter wind. Refusal to drink when challenged becomes its own form of truth, doesn't it? The brilliance of the trap became clear. Anyone who refused the draft after being challenged would be seen as having something to hide, their honor questioned even without supernatural compulsion. But those who drank would be forced to reveal their true intentions, stripping away the careful lies that made civilized brutality possible. This is madness, Eric said again, but his repetition only emphasized his fear. Is it? Rurick stepped forward, his massive frame casting shadows across the clearing. Seems reasonable to me. Let any man who claims pure intentions prove them. Let truth be tested by those willing to stake their lives on it. He held out his hand toward Ingrid. If you drink, I'll drink. If you face the gods' judgment, I'll face it beside you. The offer struck her like a physical blow. Here was a man she barely knew, offering to submit to supernatural truth-telling simply to stand with her. It was either the gesture of someone with genuinely pure intentions, or the gamble of someone so confident in his ability to manipulate truth that even divine compulsion didn't frighten him. And after, she asked, if we both drink, if we both speak truth for a day and night, what then? Then the village hears what we really think, what we really want, what we really intend, Rurik replied simply. And they judge accordingly. Gunnar's voice cut through their exchange like a whip crack. I forbid this foolishness. As your kinsman, as your jarl, You have no authority here. The new voice came from an unexpected source, Bjorn the blacksmith, who stepped forward from where he had been watching at the crowd's edge. His massive frame and soot-stained hands spoke of a lifetime of honest labor, and his words carried the weight of unquestioned integrity. Blood-right claims must be witnessed and acknowledged within 3 days of declaration, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent clearing. You made no such claim when the girl was born, when her father died, when she first showed her healing gift, or any time in the 8 years since. The law you invoke requires timely assertion, not convenient discovery. Gunnar's face darkened with anger. You forget yourself, Smith. You have no standing to interpret law. I have standing as a freeman of this village, Bjorn replied calmly, and as one who remembers when laws were meant to protect rather than entrap. He gestured toward Ingrid. The girl owes no kinship debt to one who never acknowledged kinship obligation. The legal argument might have continued, but Ingrid found herself moving before conscious thought caught up with intention. She lifted the vial to her lips, feeling the warmth of the glass against her skin, smelling something that reminded her of deep forests and older magics. "Wait," Gunnar began, but she was already tilting the vial, already letting the dark liquid touch her tongue. The taste was indescribable, bitter as wormwood, sweet as honey, metallic as blood, all at once and none completely. It burned down her throat like concentrated starlight, and for a moment the world around her seemed to shimmer with hidden meanings. Then clarity struck like lightning. Every face in the clearing suddenly seemed transparent, their hidden thoughts and motivations as visible as their physical features. She could see Gunnar's cold calculation warring with genuine fear of exposure, Eric's terror battling with residual hunger for possession, Astrid's fierce love mixed with worry for consequences beyond her control. And Rurick. She turned to look at him and saw something that made her breath catch. Not the careful control she had expected, not the predatory patience of a man used to getting what he wanted. Instead, she saw someone as afraid as she was, but afraid of different things, afraid of failing to protect what he had claimed to value, afraid of proving himself no better than the men he opposed, afraid of wanting something he had no right to possess. "Your turn," she said, offering him the vial with hands that trembled only slightly. Rurik took it without hesitation, downing the remaining liquid in a single swallow. For a moment his pale eyes went wide, then he blinked, and she saw the same crystalline clarity descend over his features. "Well," he said, and his voice carried a note of wonder. "This is going to be interesting." Around them, the crowd pressed closer, anticipation and fear warring in equal measure. Some looked eager for the revelations to come. Others appeared ready to flee rather than witness truths they preferred to remain hidden. "So," Sigrid said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "let us hear what the gods would have us know. Ingrid, child, speak your truth. What do you really want?" The compulsion rose in her throat like wine, impossible to resist or deny. When she spoke, the words came with crystalline clarity and absolute honesty. "I want to be free to choose my own path without being claimed like property. I want to use my healing gifts without fear of those who would control me through violence or law. I want to find love that is freely given and freely received, not bargained for or demanded as debt." She paused, feeling more words rising. "And I want to see every man who has used fear to control women face the consequences of their actions." The silence that followed her declaration was profound. Then Sigrid turned to Rurik, her expression expectant. "And you, Rurik Ironson, what truth would the gods have from you?" Rurik's answer came without hesitation, his deep voice carrying across the clearing with absolute conviction. "I want to prove that strength can protect rather than possess, that a man can stand with a woman rather than over her. I want to earn trust instead of demanding it, to build something worthy instead of taking what others have built." His pale eyes found Ingrid's face. "And I want to discover whether I'm capable of love that gives rather than takes, whether I can be more than the violence that shaped me." The honesty of it hit her like a physical blow. In his words, she heard not the careful manipulation of a predator, but the desperate hope of someone trying to become better than what he had been made to be. But before she could fully process the implications, Sigrid's attention turned to the two men who had started this confrontation. "Erik Gunnarsson," she called, her voice carrying the authority of inevitable judgment. "Will you drink and speak your truth before us all?" Erik stared at the empty vial in Rurik's hands as if it contained serpents instead of residual drops of dark liquid. The color had drained from his face, leaving him pale as fresh snow, and his hand trembled where it rested on his sword hilt. He began, then stopped, his throat working as if the words had turned to stones. "There's no more of the draught. I cannot drink what has already been consumed." "True enough," Astrid said, moving forward with the slow deliberation of age. "But I have carried that vial for 40 years, child. Did you think I would prepare only enough for 2? From deep within her herb pouch, she withdrew a second vial, smaller than the first, but unmistakably of the same ancient craftsmanship. The liquid within swirled with the same dark radiance, and the runes carved into its surface seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "The gods provide for those who seek truth," she said simply, offering the vial to Eric. "Will you drink, or will you let silence speak for you?" Eric's breath came in short, sharp gasps. Around him, his companions had begun to edge away, their earlier solidarity crumbling in the face of supernatural judgment. Even his father stood silent, calculating whether supporting his son was worth the risk of exposure. "This is not justice," Eric said desperately. "This is witchcraft, ancient madness that has no place in civilized law." "Is it madness to seek truth?" Sigrid asked, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "Or is madness the thing that fears truth's revelation?" The crowd pressed closer, sensing the critical moment. Ingrid found herself holding her breath, still feeling the strange clarity of the draft coursing through her mind. She could see Eric's terror as clearly as if he had painted it on his face, not just fear of exposure, but fear of what truths might pour from his lips once the supernatural compulsion took hold. "Speak quickly." "Boy," called out an older warrior from the crowd, one of Gunnar's own men. "Your hesitation shames us all." The pressure was mounting from every direction. Eric looked around desperately, seeking escape, support, any alternative to the choice before him. But the circle had closed completely now, villagers pressing forward until retreat was impossible. "Very well," he said finally, his voice cracking with strain. "Give me the cursed thing." He snatched the vial from Astrid's hands with more violence than necessary, as if speed might somehow lessen the consequences. For a moment he hesitated, staring down at the dark liquid within. "Eric," his father said quietly, and something in Gunnar's tone made everyone turn to look at the Jarl. "You need not do this. A man's honor is not measured by his willingness to submit to superstition." It was a lifeline, an escape offered by the one person whose authority might still protect him. But to take it would mean acknowledging cowardice before the entire village, would mark him as someone who feared his own truth more than any supernatural consequence. Eric's jaw tightened with desperate resolve. "No," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I am no coward. Let the gods judge what they will." He lifted the vial to his lips and drank. The effect was immediate and visible. Eric's eyes went wide, then his entire body shuddered as if struck by lightning. When the tremors passed, his expression had changed completely. The careful mask of civilized authority stripped away to reveal something raw and hungry underneath. "Now," Sigrid said into the breathless silence, "speak your truth, Eric Gunnarsson. What do you want from Ingrid?" The words that poured from Eric's lips were like poison-given voice. "I want a breaker," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent clearing. "I want to strip away that quiet dignity she's worn like armor for 8 years. I want to see her beg, to hear her cry, to watch her realize that all her clever silence meant nothing in the end." Gasps rose from the crowd, but Eric wasn't finished. The supernatural compulsion drove him forward, forcing out truths that should have remained buried forever. "I've dreamed of it," he continued, his voice growing stronger as if confession brought its own relief. "Every night for 8 years, I've imagined what it would be like to finally have her helpless, to prove that her silence was just another form of defiance that needed to be crushed." Several women in the crowd stepped backward, horror written across their faces. Even some of Eric's former supporters looked sick at the venom pouring from his lips and your father's claim of kinship. Sigrid pressed, her voice steady despite the revelations. "What truth lies behind that?" Eric laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. "Kinship? My father cares nothing for blood ties to a healer's bastard. He sees opportunity, a way to bind the village's best healer to our house through marriage, to control both her skills and her silence about what she might have witnessed treating our wounds over the years." Now it was Gunnar who had gone pale, realizing that his son's supernatural honesty was destroying more than just Eric's reputation. "The raids we've led," Eric continued, "unstoppable now. The villages we've burned, The people we've killed for their gold and grain. Ingrid has treated too many of our wounded warriors not to have guessed where those injuries came from. My father wants her bound to us through marriage, so her silence becomes loyalty instead of choice." The clearing erupted in shocked murmurs and angry voices. These were accusations of the worst kind. Not just personal violence, but violations of the codes that governed warfare between neighboring settlements. But Eric wasn't finished. The draft had taken complete hold now, and 8 years of carefully hidden truth came pouring out like water through a broken dam. "The other women," Eric continued, his voice growing stronger as the supernatural compulsion drove him deeper into confession. "Do you think Ingrid was the only one? The miller's daughter who fell into the river last spring. I held her under until she stopped struggling. The thrall girl who ran away during harvest. She's buried in the pine grove where no one will ever find her." The crowd's shocked murmurs had given way to complete, horrified silence. Even hardened warriors who had seen battle and bloodshed looked sick at Eric's casual admission of murder. But the truth-telling was far from over. "And my dear father," Eric turned toward Gunnar with eyes that blazed with supernatural honesty. "Tell them about the Saxon monastery, father. Tell them about the children we killed for their silver chalices." "Eric, stop," Gunnar began, but his son's laughter cut him off. "Stop. The gods themselves compel my tongue. Should I fight divine will to protect your reputation?" Eric's voice rose until it carried to every corner of the clearing. "Tell them how you ordered the monks' throats cut while they knelt in prayer. Tell them how you laughed when I suggested we sell the young novices as slaves instead of killing them outright." The accusations hit the crowd like physical blows. Around the clearing, villagers who had lived their entire lives under Gunnar's rule began to see their Jarl in an entirely different light. Some looked sick, others angry, all of them horrified by the scope of the revelations. "Enough!" Gunnar roared, his hand flying to his sword. "These are not the words of my son, but the ravings of a poisoned mind." "Are they?" Sigurd's voice cut through his protest like a blade. "Then let us test that claim as well. Astrid, do you have another vial?" The old healer's smile was sharp as winter wind. "I have enough for any who would prove their innocence through divine judgment." Gunnar's face went white as his sons had moments before. The trap was perfect in its construction. Refuse the draft and confirm guilt through cowardice, or drink and face whatever truths might pour forth under supernatural compulsion. "Hashem Jarl here," he said desperately. "I will not submit to the judgment of ancient superstitions." "Then you submit to the judgment of truth revealed," Bjorn said, stepping forward from the crowd. His massive frame and honest reputation gave weight to his words. "If your son speaks lies under divine compulsion, then prove it. If he speaks truth, then face the consequences." Around the clearing, the mood was shifting like a tide. Warriors who had served under Gunnar's command began to remember raids that had seemed unusually brutal, victories that had left a bitter taste, orders that had troubled their consciences. Villagers recalled missing neighbors whose disappearances had been too easily explained. Travelers who had vanished without trace near their lands. "The evidence is already before us," Sigrid declared, her voice carrying the authority of moral certainty. Eric's words ring with the clarity of unwilling truth. "No man speaks such self-damning lies willingly, even under torture. But we must know the full scope," another elder woman added. "If there are other victims, other crimes, other conspiracies, justice demands complete revelation." Gunnar looked around the clearing and saw his authority crumbling like sand before a tide. Former allies avoided his gaze, while others watched him with expressions of growing disgust and anger. The revelation of his crimes had shattered the careful political balance that had kept him in power for 30 years. "Very well," he said finally, his voice hard with desperate calculation. "If this village has lost its mind to ancient madness, if you choose to believe the ravings of a poisoned boy over the word of your lawful Jarl, then so be it." His hand went to his sword, and steel rang as he drew the blade in one fluid motion. Around him, his remaining loyal warriors did the same, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were choosing sides in a conflict that could only end in blood. "But I will not submit to this farce," Gunnar continued, his weapon gleaming in the morning light. "I will not be judged by peasants and crones who mistake superstition for justice." The clearing erupted into chaos as people scrambled to get clear of the coming violence. Women grabbed children and ran for cover, while men reached for weapons or sought shelter behind whatever protection they could find. But Rurick was already moving, his great axe appearing in his hands with the fluid speed of long practice. The weapon seemed to sing as it cut through the air, its ancient steel hungry for the blood of those who would harm the innocent. "Gunnar!" he roared, his voice carrying over the screaming crowd. "If you want to fight, face me instead of threatening unarmed villagers." The Jarl's eyes fixed on the exile with predatory intensity. "Gladly," he snarled. "I've waited 3 years to finish what your brother's death started." The two men circled each other while chaos swirled around them, Gunnar with sword and shield, Rurik with his ancestral axe. But this was more than just a duel between warriors. It was a confrontation between old power built on fear and new hope founded on truth. Ingrid watched from where Astrid had pulled her to safety, the supernatural clarity of the draft, letting her see the battle with perfect, terrible understanding. This was the moment that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everyone in Raven's Hollow. The question was whether truth and justice were strong enough to overcome 3 decades of carefully constructed tyranny, or whether the old ways of blood and intimidation would triumph once again. The battle was swift and decisive, ending not with prolonged heroics, but with the brutal efficiency of men who understood violence intimately. Gunnar was skilled, experienced, and desperate, but Rurik fought with the focused clarity of someone who had found something worth protecting beyond his own survival. When Gunnar fell, his remaining warriors laid down their arms, rather than die for a cause that had been revealed as fundamentally corrupt. Eric, still under the compulsion of the draft, continued his horrific confessions until Astrid mercifully provided him with a sleeping draught that would last until the truth-telling wore off. 3 months had passed since that morning in the village square, and Raven's Hollow had settled into rhythms that felt both familiar and entirely new. Bjorn had been chosen as the new Jarl, a selection that surprised no one who knew his reputation for honest dealing and fair judgment. The position suited him well, though he grumbled constantly about the administrative duties that kept him from his beloved forge. Ingrid stood at the edge of the pine forest, her herb basket heavy with the last gathering of autumn before winter's grip tightened on the land. The work continued much as it always had. People still needed healing, children still fell from roofs, and the endless cycle of birth and death required a healer's steady hands. But everything had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The council meeting ran late. Rurick's voice came from behind her, warm with gentle humor. Bjorn threatened to make everyone help him shoe horses if they couldn't reach agreement about grain distribution. She turned to find him approaching through the trees, his massive frame moving with the careful grace she had learned to appreciate. In his hands, he carried something wrapped in soft cloth, one of the gifts he brought her regularly, small tokens crafted in his forge during the quiet evening hours. "Another surgical tool?" she asked, accepting the bundle with a smile. Something different this time. His pale eyes held a note of uncertainty she rarely saw there. "Open it." The cloth fell away to reveal a silver pendant, delicate as a spider's web, but strong as steel, shaped like intertwined vines that seemed to dance in the fading light. At its center sat a small stone that captured the forest's green depths and held them like trapped starlight. "It's beautiful," she breathed, and meant it. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, but more than that. It spoke of patient hours spent creating something meant only to bring joy. "The stone came from the high meadows, where you gather summer herbs," Rurik explained, his voice carrying the diffidence of a man unused to offering gifts that had no practical purpose. "I thought, that is, I hoped, you might like to carry a piece of those places with you." Ingrid lifted the pendant to catch the last rays of sunlight filtering through the pine boughs. The stone seemed to glow with inner fire, and the silver setting held it like gentle hands cradling something precious. "Will you help me put it on?" she asked. Rurick's fingers were surprisingly gentle as he fastened the chain around her neck, his touch careful and respectful. The pendant settled against her throat like a blessing, its weight familiar and comforting. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, turning to face him fully. The truth-telling draft had worn off months ago, but its influence lingered in the form of honesty that felt easier than deception. "The marriage intention," Rurick said quietly. "You're ready to discuss it. I'm ready to dissolve it," she said, and watched his face carefully for signs of anger or disappointment. Instead, she saw only patient attention, as if he had been expecting this conversation for some time. "I see," he said simply. "May I ask why?" "Because I don't want to marry someone out of gratitude or convenience or fear," Ingrid explained, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I've spent too many years being silent about what I wanted. Now that I have my voice back, I want to use it honestly." Rurik nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than hurt. "That seems wise. A marriage built on such foundations would serve neither of us well, but," she continued, stepping closer to him, "I would like to court someone. Properly, honestly, with full choice on both sides." His pale eyes brightened with something that might have been hope. "Anyone in particular you had in mind?" "A certain blacksmith who makes beautiful things and protects what he values without trying to possess it," she said, reaching up to touch the pendant he had given her. "Someone who offered me partnership instead of ownership, who saw my strength instead of my silence." "That sounds like a good choice," Rurik said, his voice carrying warmth that seemed to fill the space between them. "Do you think he might be interested in such an arrangement?" "I think he might be," Ingrid replied, then rose on her toes to kiss him gently. "But we should probably ask him directly just to be certain." His arms came around her with careful reverence, holding her close but not constraining, offering shelter without creating a cage. When they broke apart, both were smiling with the quiet contentment of people who had found something worth keeping. "There's one more thing," Ingrid said as they began walking back toward the village together. "Astrid wants to officially name me as her successor. The training will take years, and it means I'll need to travel to gather knowledge from other healers." "That sounds like important work," Rurik replied. "I assume you'll want a traveling companion? Someone to carry the heavy bags and intimidate any bandits we might encounter. Are you volunteering?" "I'm hoping," he said honestly. "I've spent 3 years learning there are things more valuable than staying safe in familiar places." As they emerged from the forest, Raven's Hollow spread before them in the gathering dusk. Smoke rose from chimneys, voices carried on the evening air, and the warm glow of hearth fires painted windows like welcoming beacons. It was home, not perfect, not without its struggles and sorrows, but honest in ways it had never been before. A place where truth was valued over comfortable lies, where strength served justice rather than ambition, where voices long silenced had finally found the courage to speak, and walking toward that home, hand in hand with someone who had helped her find her voice again. Ingrid felt something she had never quite experienced before, the quiet confidence of a woman who was exactly where she belonged, with exactly whom she chose to be.